fits in with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you heard a lot about already, and more generally our approach towards rule of law. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with an introduction to UNODC, talking about what we do. I'm going to put it in the context of the UN. And the UN can be a little confusing as an institution, so I ask you to bear with me. Then I'm going to talk more specifically regionally what we're doing here in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about UNODC, rule of law and the SDGs. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Deanna, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the project that we're working on with TIJ. And I think that's useful, because I think it's a good case study of the sorts of things that UNODC does, but also the sorts of things we can partner with institutions like TIJ on. And hopefully will be some interesting findings that she will present that you will hear about human trafficking. So let me start with UNODC. And let me also point out before I start, if you do have questions, please just put up your hand. I think it's meant to be quite a relaxed, informal setting. So even though I'm wearing a suit, I want you to think of this quite informally. And if you have any questions, pop up your hands, and I'll do my best to answer it. Good. So let me start a little bit with UNODC and our background. So if there's one phrase that I think captures what we do or who we are, I think it's this one. We are the leading UN agency in the fight against illicit drugs and transnational crime. It's going to get more complicated from here in terms of what we actually do, but this is the sort of the starting point. There's no other UN agency that does what we do, focusing on transnational crime, focusing on drugs, and focusing on the criminal justice response and strengthening the criminal justice response. We're quite new as UN agencies go. We've only been around since 1997, and we actually came to being when two other UN agencies merged. And I have to check what the exact names of them were. They were the United Nations Drug Control Program and the Center for International Crime Prevention. And they came together in 1997 to create what we now call UNODC. They're headquartered, we are headquartered in Vienna, Austria, but we do have quite a strong field presence. So we have 50 field offices across the globe. And as I mentioned, we're the lead UN agency in crime prevention and criminal justice. And it says the rule of law there, but if you remember UNDP spoke to you about 2 weeks ago, they would disagree with that. I'm sure they would say they're the leading agency on the rule of law. So we'll leave that one open. So what do we actually do? What does that mean in terms of our day-to-day work? Well, in terms of the sort of the work areas that we have, or the areas of work that we focus on, probably the main one that we do is organised crime and trafficking. So we help governments to combat organised crime, different types. This can be human trafficking, this can be wildlife trafficking, this could include other elements, drug trafficking, for example. And we do that by helping to strengthen their institutions, put simply. We're also looking at new forms of international crime as well. So cybercrime, we have a growing program in. We have a growing program in the illicit trade of artifacts, which has become a big issue, particularly in war zones. If you look at Syria, there's been a lot of trading of illicit artifacts coming out of the Syria war. And environmental crime is obviously a growing one, and one of growing importance. We work on corruption issues. So, corruption is obviously a major impediment to economic and social development. So UNODC partners with the private sector, with the public sector, and civil society to come together to strengthen states against corruption. And more recently, we've been growing in the area of asset recovery, which this is helping states to recover the assets that corrupt officials have got. That's a growing program. We're actually doing that in conjunction with the World Bank. Crime prevention and criminal justice reform. So we promote the use of training manuals, we promote the adoption of codes of conduct, and we encourage states to adopt standards and norms that will guarantee that the criminal justice system works for everyone in a country and is responsive to the needs of the people. And I think that's a very important concept when you're thinking about rule of law and what is rule of law, and I'll touch upon that again at the end of the presentation. Strong rule of law and strong criminal justice institutions also give citizens greater confidence in their country. This is an important part of the social contract that exists between a country and its people. We work on drug abuse prevention and health issues, and this is mainly through educational campaigns, and part of this is encouraging certain segments of the population not to take drugs. But it's also encouraging those who are addicted to drugs to seek treatment. And it's also about trying to convince governments to look at drug users, not necessarily as criminals, but as people who need help. So that's an important part of that aspect. And terrorism prevention is obviously now a growing area for us. And on this area, we now, UNODC has quite a comprehensive programmatic approach that involves developing long-term customized assistance, particularly to those parts of the criminal justice system that investigate and prosecute terrorism-related crimes. So those are sort of the work areas that we focus on. Now there's what we actually do in these areas, if that makes sense. So those are the thematic areas, but what do we actually do in those areas? So this is probably the largest part of our work, what is called field-based technical cooperation projects. And that means basically we have projects where we work with law enforcement, criminal justice institutions to help strengthen their response to these crimes. So that's probably 80% of what I do. So for example, I have a project now where for migrant smuggling, where we're working with investigators and prosecutors in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Indonesia, and in Malaysia to strengthen their response, strengthen investigations into migrant smuggling, and strengthen the prosecutions of migrant smuggling. So that's an example of a field-based technical cooperation project. We also do a lot of research and analytical work. A good example of this is the project that we have with TIJ. So that's a research project into human trafficking flows from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar into Thailand. And that's an important part of what we do, I think. When you're the UN, your brand, the UN, carries quite a lot of weight. So if you can change policies, change opinions, and enlighten people about some of these crimes, I think that's a very valuable task that the UN can do. So we put a lot of effort into making sure we have quality data and quality information about these different crime areas. And finally, we do normative work to support treaty bodies and governing bodies. It'll be a bit clearer what I mean by this in my next few slides, but we do have, in the international system, there are these big governing bodies that bring together the member states of the UN to discuss crime issues. So we service those bodies as UNODC. We provide the secretariat services to them, we help advise them, and then crucially we respond to what they decide to do. And a lot of that is developing norms, it's developing values, it's developing recommended policies for tackling crime issues. So now I'm going to put it in the UN context and talk a little bit about our mandates. This is very complicated. This is the UN. Don't worry too much about sort of absorbing all that information. I've actually worked in the UN, I think, 11 years now, and I would say probably 70% of the people I work with just have no idea what it is. So I have no expectation that in the space of 40 minutes you'll understand it. But I think it's important when you think about, it's important to know a little bit about how the international architecture works when you're looking at what UNODC does and why it does what it does. So here you have what are called the 6 principal organs of the UN. And these were actually set up in 1945. So when the UN started, these were the main organs. There's some of these I'm sure you've heard of. There's the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. Now, UNODC, the important body for us is the Economic and Social Council. So the Economic and Social Council, as I'll describe it in a little bit, is basically responsible for managing all of the economic and social development issues within the US. And then under it is something called the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Commission. That's us in UNODC, and we're up there. And that means that you can see that we're directly responsible to the General Assembly. So what that means is all 193 countries that are members of the UN sit in the General Assembly. And unlike some other parts of the UN, UNODC is part of the UN Secretariat that responds to the General Assembly. So it's different from UNDP, it's different from UNICEF. We take our orders more or less directly from the General Assembly. So just to talk a little bit about that first body, the UN Economic and Social Council. So as I said, it's one of the main organs of the UN, and it's responsible for the 14 UN agencies that work on social and economic development. Part of the ECOSOC are 15 commissions, and these are both regional commissions, such as SCAP. I'm not sure, here in Bangkok we have SCAP, which is one of the example of a regional commission. But there's also it's also responsible for thematic missions, and an example is the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which I'll talk about in a minute. All member states of the UN have an opportunity to be a member of the ECOSOC. It actually has 65 people and they rotate. But at some point, all the countries rotate through that. And I understand you heard a lot about the SDGs in the last 2 weeks. This was actually a key body in contributing to the SDGs, developing and promoting and then monitoring them. The UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, this was established by ECOSOC in 1992. And it's the principal UN body that deals with transnational crime issues. And it really focuses on developing mandates and priorities to improve the international action to combat national and transnational crime. And it also tries to makes recommendations, policies, treaties to strengthen criminal justice institutions. It's also a forum for exchanging information on crime issues. So all the countries can come together there, share information on crime issues, have discussions around particular crime issues, and then that helps to set policy for the sorts of things that UNODC does. And it's through its resolutions primarily, the Crime Commission tells UNODC what to do. I've got a little video now actually. So this is about the UN Crime Congress, which is another important body. This will just give you a bit of a flavour of what it's done and what it does. I actually was part of a workshop that we ran with Microsoft, and this was about a year ago on human trafficking, and none of their PowerPoints, none of their videos worked. So I figured if Microsoft can't get it right, then I don't feel so bad if this isn't. Oh, that's not right. Perhaps I'll we'll go back, keep trying if you wouldn't mind, and then we'll go back to it when it starts rolling. So it seems to be loading second by second. So, yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good exercise. Maybe try and have it loading in the background if that's possible. So hopefully you'll see that video. It's more interesting than hearing me talk for 40 minutes, but we'll come back to that if we can. So all of these bodies, all these big international bodies, one of the most important things they've done is they've helped to set up international instruments in the fight against transnational crime and in the sort of the aim of strengthening the criminal justice response to transnational crime. Now these instruments are really at the heart of a lot of what the international community and UNODC does when we talk about strengthening the rule of law. These are very key. From the UNODC's perspective, these give us our mandate in these different areas. So here are 4 examples of some key international treaties. We have the United Nations Convention Against Illicit Trafficking on Narcotic Drugs, the Convention Against Corruption, the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and it's not a convention, it's a General Assembly resolution on terrorism. So those give us our mandates, and we use these to basically create entry points, I guess, with the countries, where we help them and strengthen their criminal justice response, based on what they've already agreed to in these particular treaties and conventions. So to take one example, we have the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, or UNODC. This is the important one for me, for example, because I deal with human trafficking and migrant smuggling. So it entered into force in 2003, and 189 countries signed this. And you can see regionally, all of the ASEAN countries have signed this. So Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, etc. So they've all signed it. And that's really important when you think about an international response to criminal justice issues. It's very difficult to have police in one country cooperate with police in another if they have completely different laws. If migrant smuggling is a crime in one country, but it's not a crime in another country, how are they going to cooperate on these issues? So it really is an important part in criminal justice collaboration. It's supported by 3 protocols. There's one against migrant smuggling, one against human trafficking, and one against illicit arms trade. So we find this, one of the things that we often do in our job is we try and promote this and get countries to think back to their commitments in this protocol. And just to give you a little flavour of what those commitments are, countries that have signed up to this protocol agree to create certain domestic criminal offences. So human trafficking is the same in country X as it is in country B. They agree to adopt new and sweeping frameworks for extradition, mutual legal assistance and law enforcement cooperation. So again, the transnational element of the criminal justice response, helping them to work together by creating mechanisms that allow them to work together. And it also promotes the training and technical assistance for building the capacity of institutions. And that's an important part of what UNODC does. So how does this all fit together? It's sort of lots of this and that, and there's big blobs of things everywhere. Basically, put simply, you have your governing bodies here, the Commission on Crime Prevention, Conference of Parties to the UNODC, the treaties. That feeds into UNODC, tells us what to do. These are the sorts of things, these are the policies you need to consider. And then we translate that into action on the ground in strengthening institutions in the criminal justice area. So we then go and try and promote global adherence things like the UNODC and other treaties. We help states to implement their commitments. We help states to develop or adapt their legislation. And we help the criminal justice response by trying to work with police, judiciary, immigration, to try and build their capacity. And we also attempt to build the evidence-based knowledge. And that comes back to what I was talking about, the importance of research. So perhaps now I'll say a few words on the regional program. So what are we actually specifically doing here in Southeast Asia and the Pacific? First, let me say a little bit about the transnational crime problem in Southeast Asia. So in about 2013, UNODC did a study. It's called the Transnational Threat Assessment. And what we did is we went and we collected data from countries, from other partners, and we tried to estimate how big transnational organized crime economy actually is. And we came up with these numbers, and I'm not pretending they're perfect. I think we quite openly admit this is an estimate. So I wouldn't sort of take this at face value, but it also gives you an important idea of the comparative differences. So, with the illicit economy, this is annually, illicit drugs, you're looking at $31.3 billion. Counterfeits, 30 billion. Environment, 24 billion. And people, i.e. migrant smuggling, human trafficking, it's 2 billion. That's a lot. I think that's quite striking when you see it. And it's even more striking when you consider that is bigger than the gross national product, the GDP, also the gross domestic product, of several countries in Southeast Asia. So if transnational crime were a country in Southeast Asia, it would be one of the richest. To put it in perspective, I think it's 6 times the size of Cambodia's GDP altogether. And it's also interesting to see the differences there. Drugs are still at the top, counterfeits come very close. And people say to me, well, why are you working on human trafficking and migrant smuggling? It's only 2 billion. Why should we pay any attention to that? But I always like to stress, money is one thing, but there's suffering and the human rights abuses that are associated with the people element, I think. I mean, it deserves the status, it deserves the investment that goes into it. But I'm not saying that because I work in that area. Some people actually think this is a conservative estimate. So they think the true numbers are actually higher. So for example, there are certain forms of illicit drugs that are not included in this estimate. And there are certain, this doesn't include the arms trade, for example. So the numbers could actually be bigger if we had a more comprehensive assessment. So the backdrop to the transnational crime situation in Southeast Asia is that Southeast Asia is currently going through enormous growth. These are sort of estimates, I think, from the IMF of the projected volume of goods starting in 2011. The size of the goods trade is going to increase quite considerably. And the number of international arrivals to the Asia-Pacific region is going to increase by an average annual rate of 6.2% between 2014 and 2018. These indicators obviously show positive growth within ASEAN. It's a good thing. So why am I mentioning it? Well, as ASEAN grows and the economy grows, so will the transnational crime economy, unless something is done. So all of this economic movement, all of this economic growth, it creates the opportunity for more transnational crime. The opportunity is there. And as countries grow at different rates, it creates the opportunity for migrant smuggling, for example, as migrants want to move from slow-growing countries to fast-growing countries. There are all sorts of implications for an economy that grows this fast. At the same time, you have growing integration within Southeast Asia. So the infrastructure is growing. These are just some of the major infrastructure projects. You have a north-south corridor going from China to Bangkok, an east-west economic corridor. Cross-border infrastructure links are growing. And the point that we always make when we're talking to governments in this region is, yes, economic integration is fantastic, economic growth is fantastic, but at the same time that you're investing in economic growth, you have to invest in the growth of the criminal justice institutions that will protect you at the same time. So you have to grow the rule of law at the same time as you grow the economy. Otherwise you get an imbalance. And from our perspective now, we can see a little bit of an imbalance, to be honest, in seeing it. Understandably, everyone's interested in the economic implications. But people aren't focusing in the same way on, okay, if we're going to have these links, how are we going to make sure that transnational crime doesn't exploit it? The same level of investment is not going in there. And that's an important point, I think, when we look at the situation and we project what's going to happen in Southeast Asia. This is just a slide really just to show, I wouldn't say it's a unique feature, it's an interesting feature of the ASEAN region in Southeast Asia. There's actually very different levels of capacity in government, in institutions in the region. And I think Thailand's a very interesting example. So Thailand is relatively well developed, it's a middle income country, it has relatively strong institutions, but look at Myanmar, Cambodia and Laos surrounding it. Immediately you have three countries which have a weaker rule of law, weaker institutions, and that has consequences for Thailand. So through no fault, in a sense, of Thailand's institutional strength, there are implications for the rule of law in this country, given the imbalance between the strength of institutions here and the neighbours that you have. And a classic example is the trafficking situation that you'll hear from Deanna a little bit later on. This sort of imbalance drives things like trafficking. It moves people from poorer to richer regions. So what does UNODC do here in the region to combat this? Well, we have six offices in the region. No, 7, sorry. My boss wouldn't be very happy with me. Although I cry foul. I didn't create this particular slide. Fiji, it's only one person, so I think that's cheating a little bit. It's not really an office. So the main office is here in Bangkok, and that's the regional office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And this is really the hub for the region. We also have smaller offices in Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and sort of Fiji. But I'll take that with the next slide. So we've developed a regional program around the conditions, some of the conditions that I mentioned before in terms of transnational crime in the country. I don't expect you to read this text, but I'll just highlight sort of what the main areas of what we do here is. So we have what's called Sub-Program 1, which focuses on transnational organised crime and illicit trafficking. So here we're quite heavily engaged in human trafficking issues, migrant smuggling issues, wildlife trafficking, and drug trafficking. We have an anti-corruption program as well that works a lot with anti-corruption commissions in the region. We have a terrorism prevention program. That's one that's growing. And a big issue for them is the issue of foreign terrorist fighters. So that's where I think UNODC can be useful, because there's the transnational element to terrorism there. We have a criminal justice program, which in the moment is focusing on building the capacity of the criminal justice institutions in general, so not focusing on a specific crime type. And one thing that they work a lot on and have a new set of projects on is mutual legal assistance. And mutual legal assistance, as I'm sure probably most or many of you know, is about the way in which countries formally cooperate on criminal cases. So it's a very important mechanism. And to be honest, it's one that doesn't work particularly well. So I think it needs a lot of assistance, and that's where something that's a body like UNODC can come in and help. And finally, the last one is drugs, health, and alternative development. This is particularly big in places like Myanmar, where we encourage and we give subsidies to farmers to grow crops that aren't drug-related. So, for example, they had a big opium economy. We've been working a lot in Myanmar to get them to grow alternative crops and sort of move away from the illicit economy. One thing that we do in the region to sort of enhance our work is we work a lot with regional bodies. There's a lot of forums in this region. And one example is the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting on Transnational Crime. So that's a chance for us to engage regionally with the government. There's other bodies as well. The Bali process is an important forum for human trafficking and migrant smuggling. There's something called the Mekong MOU, which is important for drugs. So there's lots of forums in this region. There's actually a lot of bodies for cooperation in this region. And there's a lot of encouraging signs of commitments made at the regional level. But as UNODC, what we always like to remind governments is it's great that you've had this commitment. It's great you've agreed that there should be law enforcement cooperation. It's great you've agreed that your criminal justice institutions should work together. But agreeing is one thing, action is another. And what we see is these commitments at the top level, they don't always filter down to the working level. So another thing that we do is we try and gather, for example, mid-level law enforcement officers to work together on live cases. That's something we're going to be doing in migrants crime and human trafficking later this year. This just shows you the sort of thing that we do to give you a bit of flavour. Basically, there's a lot of workshops bringing people together, a lot of training, and you can see some of the beneficiaries here. So law enforcement is by far our biggest beneficiary. Judiciary, sort of a bit smaller. So that's actually civil society, that one's judiciary. And drug control agencies, so there's still quite a big portion on drug control. And there's a lot of work on promoting interagency cooperation there. So, how am I doing for time? Okay, it's about 20. I don't even know when I started there. Oh really? Oh gosh, sorry, I haven't talked forever. Sorry, but I'm going to get to Deanna's part. Okay, so UNODC and the SDGs. I had another video here, but let's particularly since we're short of time, maybe we'll skip that. Now, there's the whole question of UNODC and the SDGs and the rule of law. I imagine when UNDP presented to you, they gave you the official UN definition for the rule of law. But I'm going to give it to you again, if I can find the right page. So basically, the rule of law, according to the UN, the official definition in the Secretary General's report, is it's the principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, entities, public and private, including the state, are accountable to laws. Okay. Now, there's an important aspect of that definition it's important for UNODC in how we do our work, and I want to bring it out. That's the two-way nature of the rule of law. What I mean by that is the idea, the rule of law is not just about the state creating laws and the people obeying them. That's half of it. People have to, you need a legal framework and people need to obey it. The rule of law is also about the state institutions themselves being accountable to law. And that's an important thing that we mainstream throughout all of our interventions. So when we're training law enforcement officers to catch human traffickers, we're also stressing you are accountable to the law, even though you are a law enforcement official. So we train people in human rights issues. We make it clear we have what we call a victim-centered approach. You need to have the needs and the rights of the victim at the heart of whatever you're doing. So that's really key to the UN concept of rule of law. So there's another sort of, I mean, we talk about the connections between rule of law and development, and I'll try and go through them quite quickly, but obviously you need effective rule of law, effective criminal justice institutions to have a rule of law. That's a pretty obvious point. If you don't have effective institutions, social, economic development is hindered, it doesn't really take place. In the same vein, justice systems with well-planned crime prevention strategies are not only better at preventing crime, they also create an environment that really is conducive for development. One area that we as UNODC are always talking about when we think about the links between rule of law, SDGs, development, is the whole idea of illicit trade. So where you have weak rule of law, and the national and international level, that encourages illicit trade. And illicit trade is really, has a big impact on the ability of states to develop successfully. It acts as a main source of income for organized crime groups, illicit flows, and it presents a unique challenge because it links with all sorts of other problems when we think about the development agenda. So it encourages drug cartel violence, it's linked to corruption, it's fueled by money laundering, it enhances a weak rule of law, it creates negative health and development consequences. So illicit trade, stamping down on illicit trade, is for us a big part of enforcing the rule of law. The one last thing I'll say about the rule of law, and this is from a very personal point of view. You're probably much cleverer than me, all of you in the room. I see there's a lot of doctors and things here. So, I've always found it difficult to really pin down what is the rule of law. It's one of these slightly nebulous concepts. I think the quote that I gave you earlier is perhaps one of the best ways of doing it. But just to sort of emphasize that point, I used to work in UN peacekeeping in New York and other parts of the globe. And there was a constant fight within the UN about what is rule of law. Endless fights about different definitions. Does rule of law more important than security sector reform? Is it a part of security sector reform? Endless fights. So all that's to say, if the UN can't agree on what the rule of law is, don't feel so bad if sometimes you find it's a difficult concept to pin down and make practical. For UNODC, it's also important, I think, to talk a little bit about security and development, and this is really the cost of violence. So violence obviously has a huge impact on the ability of states to develop economically and socially. Surprisingly enough, this is fairly new on the international development agenda. You'd think it was something obvious, but actually, I think back to 2011, the World Bank produced something which was the World Development Report. That was the first time that this idea became mainstreamed in the international development world, which is strange. But I think it's about typically security institutions like peacekeeping, where I used to work, or like UNODC. The development partners didn't want anything to do with us. There's this kind of like, you know, there's this discomfort, I think, with a lot of humanitarian actors, development actors, having anything to do with those evil guys who are linked with police and military. So that persisted for a long time. And it's only recently now that the institutions are working really hard to link the whole issue of security and sustainable development. And the SDGs are obviously an important part of that. So there's the Sustainable Development Goals, and these obviously follow on from the Millennium Development Goals, and you heard all about that. I think there are a few points I want to make about this, and I'll do them quickly. The first is that the Sustainable Development Goals are very important for UNODC. And why? Because we had no foothold in the Millennium Development Goals. It belonged to that world I mentioned before, the separate worlds where rule of law and security belongs there and development belongs there. So for us, it was difficult to get engaged in the Millennium Development Goal agenda. So we've been pushing hard for the Sustainable Development Goals to include rule of law and criminal justice, and they have. And that's a really important step. SDG 16 is obviously one of the important ones for us. It's not the only one. So for example, human trafficking exists under SDG 16. It's also mentioned under SDG 8 and under SDG 5. So it belongs in lots of different ones. But SDG 16 is the one that we're, as UNODC, are mostly invested in. And it's important because without the peace, the justice, and the strong institutions that 16 is aiming for, all the other SDGs will be unsuccessful, or partially unsuccessful, or not fully successful. And this is an important lesson that we learned from the MDGs. The other point I really want to make about 16, and I sort of hinted at this, is there's this slight contradiction in the SDGs. You're focusing on one area, one goal, so peace, justice and strong institutions, but you can't take them in isolation. They really are linked. So not only is this necessary for the other SDGs, you also need improvements in development, improvements in gender equality to really achieve this one as well. So they're all interlinked. And actually, the final thing, I know I keep on saying the final thing I'll say about SDG 16 is actually there's been a lot of criticism for it. Because it's going to be difficult to measure. Yeah. There's a lot of we're used to measuring development according to economic growth. There are some things you can do. Peace, justice, and strong institutions is a bit nebulous. And that's the challenge that we're all going to face, UNDP, UNODC. But most importantly, I think the countries themselves who are trying to achieve these goals. How do you measure this? The UN's done a lot of work on when I was in peacekeeping, we developed these things called rule of law indicators. And so when we were in a peacekeeping mission like I was in South Sudan, we were rebuilding the criminal justice institutions. How do you measure how well you're doing? And we came up with some rule of law indicators. And they're not bad, it's a starting point, but it's still difficult to really do that effectively. So what else can UNODC do to support the SDGs? I'm just going to highlight three things here. One is data. So I think we have access to institutions that other parts of the UN don't so much. Law enforcement, the judiciary. So we can help gather data from these institutions. So when we're looking at measuring progress, we can bring a whole new data set, I think, to the equation that other parts of the UN perhaps can't. Crime. The crime agenda is not quite explicit in the SDGs. We're talking about strong institutions, specific crimes are mentioned, but I think part of the role of UNODC is to make sure that crime remains at the forefront of people's thinking when they're looking at strengthening institutions. And finally, criminal justice practitioners. We have relationships with law enforcement. We have relationships with immigration, police, prosecutors, judges. We want to bring them into this development exercise. So that's another way in which I think UNODC can serve the SDG agenda. So I'll shortly hand over to Deanna, and I'm sorry I spoke much longer than I thought I was going to. But Deanna will, as I said, talk a little bit about the trafficking project that we've partnered with TIJ on. But I just wanted to say a couple of words about our relationship with TIJ first. So, as well as me being offered a job in TIJ many years ago, you missed that dot ticket to come with it. I'll tell you the story afterwards, perhaps. But UNODC has been involved with TIJ since it was created in 2011. We've worked closely together on workshops. We worked to develop justice indicators together, which obviously comes to the point that I mentioned of how do you measure these things. And now, obviously, TIJ has become a PNI. And this is basically a status that's awarded to certain NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that gives them an official status with the UN associated with the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Commission that I mentioned earlier. So we've been working closely with TIJ, and I think we're only going to see ourselves working more closely in future. And I think we found it a very positive relationship. So I've spoken a little bit about what I think UNODC can bring to the equation. And I think Deanna will mention this when you talk about the human trafficking project. But there's a good cooperation there. UNODC can bring the norms, the values from the global international community, and TIJ can help root it with the realities of Thailand and the region here. So I think it's important to sort of bear that in mind when we think about the rule of law institutions working together. And there's not that many examples of this I can think of around the world. So it really is quite unique, and I hope it'll only grow more effective as time goes on. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry you didn't see my videos. I promise you they were brilliant. I know I think we'll probably run out of time though. What do you think? Yeah, 3 minutes. Okay. Just maybe show the first one. Don't worry about the second one, but yeah, that one's great. So this was just to remind you. This was a little explanation of one of the governing bodies that we have and what it does, what it has done.
For 60 years, the United Nations has held congresses to strengthen international cooperation in support of criminal justice and against the global threat of crime. The first Congress, held in Geneva in 1955, adopted the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. In London, the Second Congress made recommendations on special police services for juvenile justice. Prevention of criminality was the main theme of the Third Congress in Stockholm. The Fourth Congress, held in Japan, was the first to hold preparatory meetings and the first to adopt a declaration. The 1975 Congress discussed organised crime and made recommendations on protecting people from torture and other cruel or degrading treatment or punishment. The Sixth Congress called for the development of alternatives to imprisonment, and was the first Congress to address the specific needs of women prisoners. The 7th Congress adopted the Milan Plan of Action, which drew attention to crime as a global concern, hampering economic and social development and threatening human rights and security. The Havana Congress focused on the prevention and control of organised crime and terrorism. Cairo was the venue for the 1995 Congress, which considered practical technical assistance for strengthening the rule of law. The Vienna Congress welcomed the new millennium by highlighting the crime and justice challenges of the 21st century. The declaration of the 11th Congress in Bangkok laid the foundation for strengthening international cooperation efforts and considered the threat of corruption. The 12th Congress emphasised criminal justice reform and explored ways of preventing and controlling emerging forms of crime worldwide, such as cybercrime. And now, 60 years later, the tradition continues, with the government of Qatar hosting the 13th United Nations Crime Congress. The nexus between crime and development will be the focus. The Congress will consider new forms of international cooperation and public participation through the discussions in Doha.
So it's interesting, I think, when you think about what the priorities of the international community has been in fighting crime and the rule of law. You can see how it's developed until last year, where it's now focused on the links with international development. That really is the current sort of ethnic focus, especially with the SDGs. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Davy. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Hi, my name is Deanna Davy. I'm a senior research consultant at UNODC. Thanks for the opportunity to just add a few words to the end of Ben's presentation today. And if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to jump in. I do apologise, I'm Australian. I try to beat the accent out of me, but if at any point you don't understand anything I say, I see a lot of people nodding. Okay. Thanks kindly. So I just wanted to talk for a few minutes today, about 5 to 10 minutes in fact, about a collaborative research project that we're working on between UNODC and TAJ on the subject of human trafficking from 3 source countries, which are Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar, to Thailand as a destination country. I think a short summary of the project I think is relevant to the purpose of your meeting and what we're talking about today, as it's a good example of a quality partnership between key agencies that are interested in preventing and combating crime and strengthening the rule of law, UNODC and TIJ, and a good example also of how research plays an important role in identifying issues associated with the rule of law and providing recommendations to governments and a host of other agencies about what those agencies can do to improve the rule of law. So just a little bit of information about the background of the project. As Ben mentioned, UNODC is the guardian of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, and it's supplementing protocols. The first, the trafficking protocol, and the second or third, the smuggling protocol. To that end, UNODC's primary goal is to promote global adherence to the instruments and assist states in their efforts to effectively implement them. And a crucial prerequisite in responding to the challenges of tip and song, human trafficking and migrant smuggling is fostering evidence-based knowledge on the topics to raise awareness and inform policy development. So as one of the projects that UNODC is implementing to achieve those goals, UNODC is currently conducting the joint UNODC and TIJ research project on human trafficking from Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar to Thailand. The project aims to improve evidence-based knowledge, share knowledge on trafficking in persons, and to assist project countries to identify human trafficking issues in their countries and issues associated with the law enforcement and criminal justice response to human trafficking. And just to situate the relevance, I guess, of the study and why it is that I'm up here talking briefly to you today, you're focusing on SDG 16. And while the project, I think, is relevant to quite a few of the targets under SDG 16, it's probably most relevant to the two that are on the slides: ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence, particularly against children, and promoting the rule of law at the national and international levels to ensuring equal access of justice to all. Okay, and just a little bit of information about the project background and approach. This is a study that we've been working on all year. We started in about January 2016, and as I've explained, the study is specifically on human trafficking from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar to Thailand. The methodology, there were three key methods, although we did explore more, but we ended up with a major literature review. Our colleagues in Australia who are working on the study collected, read, and analysed about 200 journal articles and reports that were published anytime between 2005 and 2016. The second method was one that I managed. I travelled around the region and conducted semi-structured interviews with representatives of government agencies, UN agencies, and NGOs, including shelters for trafficked persons in the region. And all in all, I think it was about 40 interviews, which was pretty good. And the third method was the collection of statistics. So, for example, figures on the number of victims that had been trafficked and were currently being protected in shelters, statistics on the number of arrests made of traffickers, the number of prosecutions, and the number of convictions of human traffickers in each country. We've nearly finished the draft report and we expect to have it published in early 2017. It will be publicly available, so we look forward to sending you all a copy and you reading it when you have time. It will be quite big, I should just warn you. And in terms of the content, the report will basically be divided into separate chapters explaining human trafficking in each country, and each chapter will cover things like, that's not a complete list there, flows, including the size of the flows and major routes to Thailand, information about the modi operandi of traffickers, what is it they're doing, how are they doing it, profile of traffickers, who are they, and so on, profile of victims, information on financing, fees and payments. As Ben explained before, trafficking is actually quite a lucrative form of transnational organised crime in the region. And of course, importantly and relevant to what we're doing in this meeting, talking about gaps in the legal frameworks and gaps in the criminal justice system that can be improved. Oh, sorry, I dropped a slide. Just briefly, I wanted to mention the value of the partnership and the importance of collaborating on this kind of research. We had preliminary discussions with TIJ, I think at the end of last year, on the project design and scope and what we thought the final report output should look like, which was really fantastic. And then TIJ kindly invited us to present at TIJ in January of this year. That was a great opportunity for me to present to embassy representatives, government representatives, and there were also NGOs, I think, and UN reps there as well. It was a fantastic opportunity to discuss the methodology of the project and invite people's criticisms, perspectives on the way forward and methods that we could include and not include and so on. So that was great, and we were able to embed those ideas into the research design right at the beginning, which is just fantastic. And then we had another opportunity in August of this year. This time the gentleman, Professor Andreas Schlenhardt, who is German-Australian, sorry, forgive me. He was based at the University of Queensland in Australia. He's the person who was writing the report. He was able to come and present some of the preliminary findings and also, again, receive some feedback on those findings, listen to critiques, hear people's expertise, and then those comments and feedback will be embedded in the draft version of the report. So while UNODC has been responsible for data collection and analysis, TIJ has had an integral involvement in the project and played a key role in setting strategic project goals, importantly facilitating meetings and interviews for myself with TIJ partners, and providing feedback throughout the project on the report structure, research objectives and content. So in short, TIJ has been very helpful without adding an extra layer of bureaucracy. They haven't compromised our approach in any way, but rather lent their expertise when it's been relevant and helpful, and for that we are most grateful. Oh no, not on that side, sorry. Okay. Now, as I said, we will publish the report soon, so there's probably not too much need to go into the findings in any great depth today. But just briefly, some of the key findings. I'll focus on just the law enforcement and criminal justice ones, but the first couple of bullet points, I just wanted to talk about things that might be particularly interesting, especially if any of you are working on the issue of human trafficking, you might find them interesting. There are new push factors that we've identified for human trafficking to the region. As probably many of you know, a key push factor for many years has been poverty. Some people might argue that that's true or not true, but there are emerging push factors that are actually related to poverty, and one of them seems to be debt, especially in Cambodia. And that might seem fairly obvious, but there's new forms of debt that we weren't aware of before, one of them being, for example, microfinance-related debt. So that raises many questions about our poverty alleviation strategies and how it is that we can avoid more and more people coming to Thailand in an irregular status and in situations of poverty. Another key finding is that there's definitely a nexus, as we all know, between irregular migration and human trafficking, and there's immense scope for regular migration channels to be expanded. And I'll actually go into that a little bit more in a short discussion of the recommendations, so I'll leave that point there. And there are also emerging sectors, the same sectors that people have been trafficked into in Thailand and indeed in other countries remain the same. The sex sector, sorry, that's a mouthful, so working in prostitution, whether that's in legal brothels or illegal brothels. Domestic service, there's a whole range of forced labour sectors, the fishing industry, for example, you might be familiar with. But there are also emerging ones, and one of those key ones seems to be the logging sector, particularly working on plantation forests. So this points to, I guess, the need for ongoing research in this area, because although there are certain aspects of human trafficking that have stayed the same over some decades, it's an emerging crime, and we need to keep a finger on the pulse constantly. Okay, and now findings with regards to the legal frameworks. And I'll just mention a few, because Ben and I have talked for far too long. All countries in the region now have anti-human trafficking legislation, which is fantastic, but as Ben's already pointed out, the legislation is not even, so there's a need to harmonise legal frameworks across the region. UNODC has been trying to assist in this regard. For example, in 2015, UNODC worked very closely with Laos on the development of that anti-trafficking law, and that law was passed in 2016. With regards to the law enforcement response to human trafficking, the interviews for the research have identified that in some areas, and I'm definitely not talking about Thailand here, the law enforcement capacity is still fairly weak, and the situation is exacerbated by lack of funding and lack of human resources. So the flip side of that is it's necessary to upskill constantly law enforcement personnel, especially in particular areas, for example, in proactive investigation techniques, in procedures for managing evidence, and procedures for working with vulnerable witnesses. But there are actually many barriers to data and information sharing, and I think Ben touched on this point briefly as well. We did a separate project, should I say, some time ago about human trafficking and migrant smuggling data collection practices. So the findings of that report were actually quite relevant to help us understand what was happening with human trafficking in the region for the purpose of this study. Both studies have identified that data and information collection on human trafficking, victims, offenders, but indeed across the board with regard to all crime types is probably, patchy is probably the best word for it. In some areas it's good and in some areas it's fairly non-existent. Good databases exist, especially in law enforcement agencies in the region. Police, for example, have very good databases. But other government agencies are not working with databases at all, which is probably fairly surprising for some. And in addition, standardized data collection tools have not been developed. And this leads to a situation where important bits of information and data are being recorded on pieces of paper and then sent to a central office, and the process of sending information is often taking 2 to 3 months, with the opportunity for really important information to go missing. And it obviously creates difficulties if Thailand, for example, calls Cambodia and says, Department of Social Welfare, for example, I'm just making this up, we would like information on the number of XYZ. If information is being collated on paper and there's no database, then there are obvious immediate problems to the very swift sharing of information between countries. With regards to access to justice, court cases were described in the interviews as complex and lengthy. And the fact that victims, witnesses, evidence, offenders, all these things often lie in multiple countries makes it very, very difficult for investigators and prosecutors. And data collection for the research suggested that not as many human trafficking cases are making it to court as should do. So I should probably emphasize I'm talking regionally, if not internationally here, and I'm not talking about any specific countries. The reason that many court cases are not actually happening is because there's a common practice of out-of-court settlement. Actually, this comment pertains to the region, especially the source countries of the research, sorry. And that's because there's a practice that so far hasn't been very well addressed of NGOs intervening in court cases. So, in a nutshell, what happens is shelters for trafficking victims are very, and they're very well intended. They want victims of trafficking to receive compensation for the exploitation that they have suffered. So what they do is they will call directly human traffickers and try and negotiate an amount that the traffickers will pay to the victims. And that's all nice and well, but it means that the court cases will subsequently be dropped by the victims. And that creates implications for the criminal justice system as a whole, and of course for countries' ability to increase that number of prosecutions and convictions. Victims report that they think the court cases are a little bit too long across the region. And bearing in mind that victims are often accommodated in shelters at the same time that court cases are going on, it's easy to empathise that 12 months in a shelter could be a little bit too long. And victims also describe the court process as quite confusing and stressful, and it can be actually quite expensive for them. Looking to Cambodia, for example, people explained that if you're a victim of a crime like human trafficking and you want to go to court, or you're asked to go to court, the court is often nowhere near the city or the area that you live in, so then you're liable for the expenses associated with travelling to the regional hub where the court is. You have to pay accommodation for the duration of the court case, whether that's going back and forth for a few days at a time or a period of 2 weeks, and all that time not being paid by your employer because you're not working. So these are day-to-day issues that victims face that we all need to think about. Victims don't always receive compensation at the end of court cases either. So it's important that we think about whether there's actually an incentive for victims to go through the entire stressful court process, I guess, if there's no compensation at the end of it. And also, it's important to think about when victims do actually make it to court, what does the court setting look like for them? Victims are often just a couple of feet away from their human traffickers. The media has their names, the media will broadcast their names, so it's probably important that we try and think about options for trials that mean that victims are better protected, whether that's video link options or the like. Okay, moving on to recommendations with the caveat that we haven't finished the report yet. So what I say to you today may not necessarily end up in the final report. And Dr. Hugh, if there's anything that I say that you would like me to cut, then just let me know. So in the interviews, we ask people not only what are the challenges associated with law enforcement and criminal justice, but what are your views on how we can overcome those challenges and barriers? Obviously, we expect to use people's input in the draft and the final version of the report. So for governments broadly, a couple of the key points were to harmonise legal frameworks. That's really important. And the second point was try to incentivise, where possible, regular migration channels. It's probably easier for the source countries to say that. It's probably a difficult pill to swallow for Thailand when there are so many regular and irregular migrants already in the country. And irregular migration does not necessarily cause human trafficking, but there's a nexus there that we can't ignore. That first bullet point can be sensitive. I mentioned that at a meeting last week and some people frowned at me, and I completely understand, so maybe let me elaborate. What I mean is Thailand has a very large, an aging population, and conversely, countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar have relatively young populations and a lot of youth unemployment. So that bullet point, I think, could be understood in the frame of while Thailand needs migrant workers and neighbouring countries have excess workers, it makes sense to incentivise migration channels to Thailand, regular migration channels to Thailand. And looking at it from the source country's perspective, if you're a young migrant worker, say in Cambodia, Laos or Myanmar, the entire regular migration process is still very convoluted and complex for them. There are various difficulties associated with getting a birth certificate and a passport. It's very expensive. It involves travelling to a regional centre to apply for the documents. And so for that reason, there's a whole host of recruitment agencies that have emerged to act as the middleman. But then unfortunately, some of those recruitment agencies have links to human traffickers, so on and on it goes. So I do think there's some value in that first bullet point of incentivising regular migration. With regards to recommendations for law enforcement, ongoing training is provided on human trafficking and indeed all crime types. As you probably know, police officers in the region often rotate, and every time they rotate, they take their knowledge with them. So they may have been skilled up in human trafficking issues, but they move on and take that knowledge with them. There's a need to speed up communication and information sharing in the region. Even with MOUs or other written agreements, everyone in law enforcement in the region is saying the same thing. Despite the piece of paper, it's still very, very, very difficult to get quick information about anything to do with law enforcement, about investigations, intelligence, and so on. And there may be some value in looking more to less formal, more informal information sharing channels. One thing that people said time and time again in the research is that it would be really valuable to bring law enforcement people together face-to-face more often. Everyone said there's much more value in doing that than there is in sending 4,000 emails trying to cover one point. Just bring people together to talk. There are obvious barriers to language and obvious expenses associated with doing that, but if it could be done on a semi-regular basis, that would be fantastic. People pointed to the value of creating a national referral point for human trafficking cases. So across the region at the moment, there's a situation where hundreds and hundreds of police officers have to be trained regularly on human trafficking and associated issues because they are the people who will receive reports about human trafficking cases. They will go and identify the victims. They are the people who need to understand the legislation in order to say, yes, you are a human trafficking victim, or no, perhaps you are something else, an irregular migrant, for example. So it might be easier, and it could potentially be more cost-effective to just have one national agency in each country who's responsible for identifying trafficking victims and investigating trafficking crimes. It's an approach that's been adopted so far in Australia and England, I believe, as well, and a range of other countries. And so far it seems to be working fairly well. Okay, and finally, criminal justice recommendations. So as Ben's already said, the UN adopts broadly a victim-centered approach. It would be really helpful to give victims more support both before and during court processes. It's a confusing and a worrying time going through court for victims, and victims often don't understand what to expect and what to endure actually in the court setting. And of course, as I mentioned before, the financial barrier is a key one for victims of human trafficking. So having some financial incentive to support victims when they're going through the whole case, to support them through days of missed work, something like that would be fantastic. It's really important that we de-link victim support programs from the criminal justice process. So if you're a human trafficking victim in the region, or indeed anywhere in the world, you've been trafficked and you're going to support the destination country with the court case in order to help the destination country achieve prosecutions and convictions of the traffickers. You will usually be given access to a support program, whether that's in a shelter or a community-based support program. So that's the norm. A lot of countries, and my country included Australia, have had a system where they create many different sort of visa frameworks to deal with these victims. So for example, if you give us a lot of evidence and name traffickers and make a valuable contribution to the court case, then we will give you a visa to stay in the country for, say, 6 months. And there are many different visa categories like this. The research, I guess, points to delinking that. So saying to victims, whether you contribute to the court process or not, you're still a victim. So we will still provide you with access to our support programs for the duration of the time that you feel you need, psychosocial and other support. Returning to the comments earlier about shelter managers creating out-of-court compensation schemes for victims, that needs to be dealt with, and it will probably need to be dealt with gently. That's probably not the responsibility of anyone in this room. That's something to keep in mind for the future. And finally, increase where possible compensation for victims. So, in conclusion, I've just given you I guess a flavour of the findings of the research. Hopefully they'll illustrate for you some of the complexities associated with that particular crime type, human trafficking, and the complexities associated with the law enforcement and the criminal justice response to the specific crime of human trafficking. And of course highlight the importance of collaborations between interested and similar-minded agencies such as UNODC and TIJ. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, to Ben and Deanna, for your insightful presentation today. I hope that everyone's already learned, about the criminal justice is related to the overall, approach of the promoting of the rule of law today. So I think since we are short of time today, probably we cannot accommodate, we can accommodate probably only one comment or one question from the floor, please.
Not really a comment, but just want to let all of us see that what Ben and Deanna has mentioned is I think it's a very important point, a very strong point of UNODC that they have the kind of field-based backup of those who really know the issues that stationed in the countries where the situation happened, which I think very strong point for UNODC. And for a project like this, the trafficking, I think the evidence-based research would help a lot in making policy decisions that I think we need a lot. We lack a great deal of policy decisions based on evidence-based research. So research like this would help not only Thailand, our neighboring countries can learn not only from our success, but our failure also in dealing with the problem. And also, I think the capacity building effort of UNODC in those countries who is lacking is very important. So I think this is very useful for all of us. And And this group is not a training. They are, we call them the superheroes. We call them TAJ fellows because we want to let them help us look at the rule of law through their lens. Because as you said, the development in all the rest of the goal, the 16 rest of the goal, you said partly unsuccessful, but I would say definitely will be unsuccessful without goal 16. So we want to convince them that by looking from their lens, we want to convince them to look at the rule of law and help us promote goal 16. So I think we really appreciate that.